Welcome to another episode of the Battlefields Bourbon Podcast. We're coming to you from the historic Bell House in beautiful downtown Winchester, preserved by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. I'm Jack, joined as always by my co-host Elijah, and we are joined today by our guest co-host, Jim Goecker. Jim is a lifelong student of the American Civil War. His avocation has led to dozens of presentations around the country on topics as diverse as military intelligence and galvanized Yankees. His recent book, Hoosiers, Spies, and Horse Marines, A History of the 3rd Indiana Cavalry East Wing, is currently available through McFarland Publishing. Professionally, Jim spent 40 years in education, with the last 32 years of his career spent at Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology. Retiring as Vice President of Enrollment Management, originally from Seymour, Indiana, Jim and his wife Deb currently live in Front Royal, Virginia. Jim is a good friend of mine over the past couple of years, and we're honored to have him on the episode of the podcast. I'm going to hand it over to Elijah, though, to introduce the bourbon for this episode and how it ties into our topic.
All righty. Well, first and foremost, Jim, welcome on. We're glad to have you. I think it's going to be a great episode, and I'm excited to hear a little more about this Indiana regiment. So as we get into it, we've got George Remus today, just a regular baseline 94 proof bourbon. This one is an MGP product. Those of you that are a little more well-versed in bourbon probably know about MGP. They source a lot of distillates and whiskeys for other distilleries, up-and-coming brands, that kind of thing. This one, I guess, is a tribute to George Remus himself, which, Jim, I think you know a little bit more about him than I do. But yeah, this one is supposed to be a high rye bourbon. They don't actually disclose the mash bill, which is surprising for an MGP product. Usually they're pretty transparent on that end of things. But yeah, aged a little over 4 years, so they say. High rye bourbon should have a little spice to it. I don't think anybody here has tried this one yet, have we?
No.
Not yet?
No.
All right, so this is going to be a first time for everybody. So we'll crack it open and give
Nice
it a
pop.
That was
Nice
a good one
pop.
too. Let's see what we think here.
Yeah, just a little background on George Remus. He was a pharmacist from Chicago and got involved in the liquor business around Prohibition and actually was able to keep the distillery open because of his role as a pharmacist. So, but he was not the only one or the only business that he purveyed that with. He became a major bootlegger during the Prohibition. But he kept the distillery open. Of course, that became what you're about to tell us at MGP.
Yeah, so he is supposed to be the king of the bootleggers. Would make sense if that's the case. Being a pharmacist, he kind of has the access to whiskey that others at the time wouldn't have had. So that would obviously help him earn his place as such a person back during Prohibition in that time. But yeah, I mean, this is, I'm assuming, not his exact recipe if he made bourbon himself, but I guess a nice tribute to the man himself. And without further ado, we ought to give this thing a little nosing, a little tasting, and see what we think. Smells familiar. Smells like bourbon. You can definitely taste that rye spice.
I was going to say, it feels pretty sweet to me.
I get a little maple.
Yeah. I get sweetness.
Yeah.
This
The
is probably the
spice
first
definitely-
one where it's like been a flavor I can get on board with too.
Yeah. The spice subsides really quickly, I've noticed. I mean, that one, it's a little kick at the front end, and then it, like you said, it kind of has that maple
Yeah.
note to
Yeah,
it.
it's on the back end.
I like that a lot, though.
What is this? What's the MSRP on this, Elijah?
I believe these days it's about $50, $55.
And it's easy to find, I think. I mean, we found this at the ABC store here in Winchester, and it was, there's tons of them on the shelf and
Yeah.
pretty easy to get. Neat bottle, too. It's got that picture of Remus on it, and it's got Lawrenceburg, Indiana written there on the front. On the what did you call it on the glass? It's
embossed.
Embossed on the glass. Yes, Jim. Yeah. Jim, do you mind diving a little bit into briefly about your history with bourbon and whiskeys?
Oh, golly. I was not very involved in it. I started out as a youth, drink all the crap we used to go drink back in the day. We won't go into that history. But came to bourbon in the last 7 or 8 years, and I've really come to enjoy it. And my taste leaned towards the wheated, but this is not, for a high rye, this is pretty good.
Yeah. What we assume to be a high rye, correct?
I believe it says somewhere on the bottle. I'm not sure.
You were looking it up before, and the notes of what they said was in it made it lean towards a higher rye.
Yeah, it doesn't exactly say what it is, but everyone that I've ever talked to about it thinks it's a high rye bourbon. But that sweetness is just that's unique. That's interesting.
If it's a rye, that's a pretty sweet rye. Yeah.
No doubt. Probably very. I mean, even if it's a high rye bourbon, it couldn't be exactly low. You know what I mean? But
really easy to sip. What's the proof on it?
94.
Yeah, so lower the proof, but.
And this is Ross Squibb Distillery, which is MGP's, like, I guess, own brand, own distillery. That's what they call their.
Yeah, they just of course, they sourced everything with everybody, and now they've opened their own brand, and that's exactly right. That's their same site.
Something I can get behind. Yeah.
Yeah, the transparency here, at least.
Yes, I like that. I like that they're upfront and honest about it. But so distilled in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, and that'll tie us directly into our topic today, which is going to be a little bit of the 3rd Indiana Cav, as well as kind of the role they played with intelligence during the war. Hoosier Spies and Horse Marines is the title of your new book. I've started reading it, haven't finished it by the airing of this pod. I'm a terrible host, but it's a really nice read for a regimental, I think, and it's really neat to get the perspective of a cavalry regiment that you don't often get with regimental series, because it's always infantry most of the time. So this is a really nice one so far, and getting the perspective of Federals too is really neat. But I have to ask Jim right off the bat, what is a Hoosier for folks that don't know?
You've got at least 2 theories on where that came from.
Okay.
One is more of a backwoodsy kind of thing, where if a traveler's going through the woods of Indiana and came upon a cabin in a clearing, they would call out, who's there, who's there, who's here, who's your.
Oh.
It kind of became, slurred into Hoosier. Maybe they had more bourbon back then at that time, got the slur, I'm not sure. The other one is that there was a railroad superintendent that was helping put railroads through Indiana by the name of Hoosier. Mm-hmm. And the men that were putting in the rails were known as Hoosier's men, and that became kind of, identifying Indiana people as general. So the reality is nobody knows. You can make up anything you want, I suppose.
But it's something very unique to the state.
It is very much.
It's used a lot. It's a wartime slang too.
It was already in use at that time.
Yeah.
That's right. So whatever its origin, it had to occur in the first half of the 19th century. And both of those stories kind of fit in that range as it is.
Yeah. No, I'm excited. Well, how about you lead us into this regiment, why it's the one of choice possibly for you, and the importance in your eyes that it plays during the war.
Well, we'll start with the importance to me. My wife was into genealogy and still is, working very diligently on it. And it was probably 22, 23 years ago that she said, I think I have a relative that fought in the Civil War. I said, well, that's interesting, because that's always been, as you said, my avocation. And as I started looking into this, I knew my relatives had not fought. They had come as Germans early before the war, kind of kept themselves, never really got involved. So I thought it would be interesting to actually research a unit and an individual that had a family connection. Quickly found out that he was a member of the 3rd Indiana Cavalry. And, that's kind of interesting, just again, starting reading about the unit and realized that it was kind of a unique, at least in my opinion at that time, a unique unit. Half fought in the Eastern Theater, half fought in the West. 2 companies for one time were kept in Indianapolis and actually chased Morgan through Indiana across to Ohio. So you had this very unique perspective of one unit being involved in really almost 3 different theaters. Ironically, as I worked on it, it took a long time to do the research and then start the writing. So probably around 2012 or 13, I unfortunately was infected with a computer virus in my computer at home, locked up all my files. I thought it was over at that point, and pretty much gave up because I'd already started writing. Half my research was there, and it was impossible to recover. When I retired in 2018, or right around 2019, I was at work cleaning off my computer and which files to keep and what have you, and I found an old copy that I'd somehow, for some reason, had it on my work computer. So that reignited it, and long story short, here it is, 2023, being published 23 years after the idea was
Better late
started.
than never.
And ironically, her relative, her great-great-great-grandfather, who was in the West, I've not been able to recover enough to really do that justice, so he's not in the book.
Yeah, so you went straight for that. Well, based off what you've told me too, and we're biased being in the Valley, but the role they play in the Eastern Theater is fascinating. More towards the end, but it's a great perspective on how the war develops regiments and how they adapt and overcome to certain scenarios and are stagnant. Just the whole aspect of a war through the eyes of these Hoosiers. So yeah, these are where are these guys from? These guys well, I guess at this point, start off with the beginning.
Sure. The beginning was July 61. The state had made an announcement that they were going to raise one cavalry regiment at that time. Manassas had not occurred yet. And there was such demand to join and what have you. They finally said, okay, we're going to authorize one cavalry unit because it cost $500,000 to outfit a regiment. And no one thought the war was going to last long enough. The other thing is cavalry from 18 months to 3 years was the expected time to really train up a cavalryman to take care of his horse, learn his tactics as both a mounted troop as well as a dismounted troop. So no one wanted to go that expense, not expecting it, that the war would last. So one regiment was started. It was the 1st Indiana Cavalry. And after Manassas, it became obvious there was going to be a greater need across the board. So everyone flocked to Madison, Indiana. 6 companies ended up in Madison, Indiana, which is just west of Lawrenceburg. That's our tie-in, by the way, today. Dearborn County raised one of the companies for the 1st Indiana Cavalry, which included Lawrenceburg. So not to steal anybody's thunder, but give you an idea of why we have Remus here today. 8 companies went to Evansville, Indiana, on the other side of the state. So already you had 14 companies, as 4 past the authorized size. As the war progressed, those troops, as they were being raised, were being sent to the area of most need, and it was perceived in August that the Eastern Theater needed troops. It was right after Manassas, of course, and everybody's still panicking. So the 6 companies in Madison were immediately sent to Washington, D.C. The other 8 eventually were ordered to St. Louis. By October, the powers be finally figured out that 8 companies in St. Louis and 6 companies in Washington, D.C. did not necessarily make for the best organization. So they designated the 6 in Washington as the 3rd Indiana. And by that time, a 2nd had already been raised, so they didn't become the 2nd Cavalry, they became the 3rd Cavalry. So they start life as the 1st Indiana Cav, and 2 months later, they're reorganized into the 3rd Indiana Cav.
Now, to get to the Eastern Theater, did they travel by rail? Did they ride their horses across the country to get there? Because that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily understand when these troops, whether they be Union or Confederate, starting out Western.
They did all 3.
So they rode out, or marched out as well.
They took, since we're on the Ohio River, they jumped steamboats and headed east and got all the way to Wheeling. And it was a drought year, so that the water in the Ohio River had gotten so low they had to stop at Wheeling. But the nearest railroad was Pittsburgh. So they offloaded at Wheeling. They did not have horse equipment. Most of them were bareback, had no saddles, had anything, and they rode to Pittsburgh. So there's even excerpts of where they would stop by farmers and either borrow or steal straw to fill in a bag to make a rudimentary saddle, and clotheslines to make rudimentary stirrups and what have you. So they arrived in Pittsburgh and were loaded on hog cars and sent to Washington on livestock trails.
Wow!
So they kind of did all 3, but that was part of the importance of getting there as fast as possible. And of course, they were anxious. They were all volunteers. They come here to fight the war. They were still, I want to be a part of this before it ends. So they all jumped and did what they had to do.
Sure. That's something that you don't normally hear about or,
They think they just appeared.
Yeah. It's like,
Right.
okay, how did these soldiers from this state get out east? I mean, it's a lot of logistics and planning and stuff, whether it be by rail or water or marching or riding, whatever the case may be. And I mean, it's something it's really cool to see how they end up there, and especially in such a short amount of time for that time period, because I mean, usually that takes months, weeks, whatever the case may be, to get from one place to the other. I mean, that's not a quick journey by any means.
It was about a 2-week journey.
Wow.
Which that shocks me. That's a quick travel.
Yeah,
honestly.
by the time they got on it took a while to get enough ships or steamboats, riverboats to carry 600 men plus mounts,
Right.
plus all the other stuff. And at that time, they're not armed. They still don't have cavalry. They don't have saddles or anything. But the other unique thing about the unit was they provide their own horses.
Wow.
They got paid 12 cents a day throughout the war for the use of the horse. So a lot of the guys were not cavalrymen. They were barely, farmers or storekeeper or whatever. Again, they were used to horses. So they would beg and borrow someone to borrow a horse. They would rent a horse. There's even an article in the local newspaper about, this is a great money-making opportunity, and it seems appropriate they get paid extra, and encouraging people to rent their horse to a cavalryman to take to war. It took a long time, but when you put it in perspective of 1860, 2 weeks, given all the things that were going on, not too bad.
And this is probably some of, the first time some of these boys have left the state or,
Even their county.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now they get to go up the Ohio River and then, get to see western Pennsylvania. And then they're coming down to D.C. and they get to see the capital of the United States.
No question. And a lot of them had, of course, Abe Lincoln grew up in Indiana. Yeah. So the idea of a fellow Hoosier as president, I think, added a little bit to it. They had a little bit of a shock on the way, about halfway. I forget exactly where it was, but they ran into, it must have been Wheeling, a group of Confederate prisoners who had been maybe down in Western Virginia early in the war. And one of them was a resident near their homes, Bennington, Indiana, which is not too far from Lawrenceburg in that area. And a lot of the men, I think, began to realize this was going to be a very personal war because here's their neighbor, everyone, and he's fighting on the other side.
Yeah.
And that really brought home a lot to them that this was going to be real, before they got to a fight. Yeah.
Wow. So they get to Washington. What's next? What are they sent to do?
They spent a few weeks in Washington training. There's a lot of funny stories about men and horses trying to be trained. I'll let you read the book about those. But when you go and look at the 1861 map of the United States and the politics, Maryland was obviously one of those border states. And there's going to be elections in the fall of 61. So one of the things that they moved to eastern Maryland, down along the Potomac, and were scattered along that coastline for the better part of the rest of 61 and the first 4 months of 62. Their job was early on to make sure that nothing happened at the polling stations. In other words, let's also make sure that the right people get elected. So many times, or at that time, they were actually stationed at the polling stations. I don't think there was any active effort to keep people from voting, but certainly their presence, I think, made it a little bit more intimidating for secessionists to come in and vote.
Sure.
Their divisional commander there was Joe Hooker. And this will play a big role in their future because he loved intelligence. He was a big consumer of intelligence. And one of the things he did was encourage these troopers down along the river, and they were the only ones there really, to collect information and pass it back. So they got pretty adept at passing as local rivermen. Some of them had been rivermen in Ohio. So they, back in Indiana on the Ohio. So they would go in at the bars and hang out along the river, and they would collect information and pass it along. So many of them got, again, pretty good at that activity. At the same time, they were intercepting equipment that was crossing the Potomac out of Baltimore down the East Maryland and then across to Virginia. So that was the other part, too, is the interdict on that and make sure those supplies did not reach the Confederacy.
And what are they? So these guys are trained for a couple weeks in D.C. Now they're in eastern Maryland along the Potomac, collecting intelligence, watching the waters, but watching who's crossing. What are these boys equipped with?
Well, they were equipped with the most up-to-date equipment that could be found, which means really old stuff. They finally got saddles and stirrups and bridles and all the horse equipment. And they were so excited because it announced they were good. They had sabers. Sabers were issued to them back in Indiana, which of course made them look really great to the townspeople.
That's the cool thing about cavalry. You've got the sword.
That's right. They were uniformed. They had swords, or like they owned the town. Well, the next time they get weapons is like September, and they're expecting Colt revolvers because they get 1842 single-shot muzzle-loading pistols, foot-long, 54 caliber smoothbore, one apiece. So that's their armament as they go to war, is a one pistol, percussion cap, smoothbore, muzzle-loading pistol. That's it. Now, later on, they had 10 carbines issued per company. But even at that, that's 100 and there's 600 men, and who gets them? And they don't describe what model, but my guess they were probably Halls. They were probably same vintage as the muzzle-loading pistol they had. So the Hall was an early carbine, 1840s. So that's how they were trying to stop all this activity going across the Potomac.
So as they're there, and how many months are they in?
They're there. They're there about 7 months through the winter of 61, 62.
Okay, so they're there. What's the feeling amongst these men as not large scale battles are taking place, but soldiers are moving, soldiers are leaving the division that they're with or that they see, and they get to see them march off and have another deployment somewhere. What's the feeling amongst these Indianians?
Well, obviously they'd come, they were patriotic. They come to serve. They wanted to, again, the war's going to end and we're going to be left back here and we'll never be able to show our faces at home again. So in 62, as McClellan is gathering his army to go south towards Richmond, these guys are literally watching the infantry units across the peninsula, slowly the Hooker's division leaving and joining the army, and then literally could watch the transports go past them as they sat there on the Potomac. So you can imagine how that felt and how unhappy they were, and they made sure their governor knew that. Governor Morton was a well-known wartime governor, had a lot of power within the Republican Party in the nation as well as Indiana, and they complained bitterly to them. We think you've traded us in for the home guard of Maryland. Why are we left here? And there's countless letters to congressmen worrying about 600 men in an army of, 80,000. Needless to say, nobody cared. And they
I was going to wonder, does that play an effect with politics at the time, that there's 600 plus Hoosiers sitting there in Maryland not seeing action, and they complain and things like that? That gets back. Does that make the people in Indiana, feel a certain way that, well, we sent our boys off to war and they're not providing anything to it?
I think certainly among Western troops in general, including the ones from Indiana, when they were sent east, they were viewed as Westerners, a little more uncouth, a little less sophisticated, not as, they were looked down upon. So anytime they felt like they were being slighted, they interpreted that as part of this quote-unquote prejudice against them as Western men. So, yeah, it played into it.
And so what's the morale like amongst these men once they're there for, what'd you say, 7 months or so, and they're not seeing battles? It's basically 7-month picket duty. How does that affect the troops themselves?
Well, you can imagine that at some point they're pretty discouraged. You do have several of the officers resigning and heading back home, which maybe is not a bad thing. I think we all, as we read history and Civil War history, that was a common event early in the war. You would bring in, someone would raise a company because they were a lawyer, but perhaps incredibly unfit for military service, and they would end up resigning, and more able men would move up. Same thing happened there. You had a couple people shoot themselves in the foot or whatever on purpose to get a discharge. At that time, it was fairly easy to get a discharge, or if you fell off your horse and broke your leg, you get a discharge. So there was a little bit of that. I don't want to overstate it, 2 or 3, but you can imagine they see the war coming. They see McClellan, and they see these boat after boat after boat after boat going by. Goes, oh my God, this war is going to end. Look at all the. How could they possibly not win?
Yeah,
and we're going to be left here, and we're never going to be able to again show our faces because we were stuck in the backwaters.
Not what they thought it would be.
Yeah.
No, not exhausted. Yeah, cavalrymen, they expect to be, saber in hand,
charge,
galloping, and making very dashing in battle. They've seen all the paintings from the Waterloo and what have you. So, but obviously it didn't turn out that way.
So once they finally get out of their situation here, just picketing, collecting intelligence, that kind of thing, what next? Where do they go?
Well, in April of 1962, they're called to Washington, and they actually go on provost duty in Washington. They're sitting with their sabers on shoulders at intersections to make sure that carriages didn't run. No, worse. They were policemen at that point, making sure the carriages weren't ridden too fast or whatever. That mercifully lasted about a week or two.
But they're in downtown Washington.
They're in downtown Washington.
They get to do a little bit of sightseeing.
They did.
There.
No, that's true. They did do that, and when they were in training, but that's again not why they were here.
Exactly.
They were a little
it gets
frustrated.
old after a while.
Real fast. And bear in mind that there's 6 companies throughout the war. They're expected to do the duty of a full regiment, which at that time was 10 companies. But in the mid '62, Congress authorized each cavalry unit to go to 12. So they're at a half unit at that point compared to everybody else. So when you say picket, if they went on picket duty, they're expected to cover the same front as a 12 company regiment. So they were pulling double duty throughout the war.
Well, because when they're planning those logistics, whether it's Hooker or whoever, he's just seeing 3rd Indiana. He's not seeing 3rd Indiana that contains 6 companies, 600 men. He's just seeing 3rd Indiana, another cavalry regiment, boom, let's spread them that way, this way.
At best, they would see brigade strengths, and and they don't even know.
So they're not even okay. Right. So that's up to those leaders to figure it out, and back down to the captains or the colonels or whoever. Yeah. Okay, so April of 1962 comes around. At least in the Valley, we know Jackson's running up and down. Does that have an effect or draw the 3rd Indiana?
In a way, thank goodness for Jackson for the 3rd Indiana, because yes, exactly so. They get ordered out to the Valley. They cut through Thoroughfare Gap. They come through Front Royal and head down the Page Valley. Well, check that. They went down the main Shenandoah Valley, got all the way down to Luray, and immediately were ordered back north because of the fighting further south with Cross Keys and Port Republic and what have you. So their stay in the Valley at that time was pretty brief. And then the rest of 1962, they're kind of chasing around. The Army of the Potomac started cavalry out as 1 regiment per brigade or sometimes division, and half their strength would be spread out as escorts or messengers and what have you. Very ineffective use. In mid 62, they started the concept of consolidation. They created a division, the cavalry division of the Army of the Potomac, and they were actually part of that. So they're chasing around. We talked about Unison earlier. They were fighting in Unison. They were at Philemont. They were down at Amosville, all throughout that part of Virginia during the 1862.
Okay. So they're starting to see some action here.
They're seeing some action. Their colonel, they're excited. He was an old judge. He'd been a captain in the 3rd Indiana Infantry in the Mexican War, so he knew a little bit about the military. And but he got crossways with Pleasanton.
Is this Chapman?
No, this is Scott Carter. Their
Carter,
colonel.
Yep.
Scott Carter gets sideways with Pleasanton. He gets placed under arrest. A few days later, whatever it was, Pleasanton said, "Yeah, fine, you're off." And Carter said, "No, you've impugned my honor. I want a court-martial. I want to clear my name." Pleasant refused him, and in a long story short, he's under arrest until almost winter of 62 when he finally resigns and
Wow.
leaves. George Chapman, the gentleman you mentioned, was assigned to the 3rd Indiana organization. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy. He served on the Old Ironside. There's even logbooks of as a midshipman. He gets knocked overboard in the Mediterranean. They have to fish him out.
Wow.
But he does that. He gets out of the Navy. He becomes a newspaperman in Indiana, gets involved in Republican politics. So he's from Indianapolis. He's one of the very few non-Southern Indiana guys that are in that. But he was sent partly because of his military training and then also political favor. He's 5'4", glasses.
Wow.
Chapman's the picture you see in the episode image.
Yes.
He's the lone image of the gentleman sitting down. That's Chapman.
Right. You look at him, you think he's a school teacher, a storekeeper.
The glasses
something.
don't help that.
The glasses don't help. He drank a lot, but everybody did. But a lot of the men would comment about that as a negative just because they didn't like him. But it soon became apparent that he was the glue, the leadership that held the unit together because, Carter's under arrest, Chapman's in command, and eventually is promoted to colonel. And at that point, the final organization of the 3rd Indiana creates. Now, I talked about the East, and there were 4 companies back in Kentucky. That's where they were sent because that was where they were needed in 61. Eventually, they were organizationally attached to the 3rd. So we had the same situation, half and half. But when Chapman was promoted colonel, they finally promoted a lieutenant colonel to command the Western, and then the rest of the officers were split. So organizationally, they had no more unit officers than any other regiment. But again, because they were split, neither area had a complete complement of officers.
Wow. That's so interesting. Why not just
Understaffed.
fill in the rest and make them own 2 separate regiments?
Well, again, I think there's just so much going on. The war's moving wrong. Okay, we got a half a regiment. We'll deal with it. You also, what's really interesting to me again is that the 1st Indiana Cav that we talked about initially, 2 independent companies were raised like May and June of 61, and they were sent east immediately, and they became companies I and K of the 1st Indiana. It would have been very easy to take those 2 companies and at least have 8 companies of the 3rd if they just switched that, but they never did. And meanwhile, the 1st Indiana, they're organizationally out west, so these 2 were really independent companies, even though administratively they were attached to the 1st. So those 8 companies I just described are the only Indiana cavalry in the Eastern Theater throughout the war.
Really? So it's just the 3rd?
Just the 3rd, and then those 2
companies in
independent
the
companies.
1st.
Wow.
Yeah.
The whole war?
The entire war. In the Eastern Theater.
In the Eastern Theater. Wow.
Correct.
Okay, so we're coming to a close in 62.
Okay.
They were running around Virginia. Come 63, what's the feeling? This is the year of Gettysburg. This is when federal cavalry will start to take its form, like we covered in other episodes with Brainy Station and those leaders. How does this affect the 3rd Indiana 1863?
Well, they're going to reflect attitudes the same as everybody else was having at that time. I mean, if you're getting at 61 or end of 62, you've had Fredericksburg.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got the Army of the Potomac at probably its lowest level morale-wise ever. So they turn to a new commander like they typically did, and they get Hooker, the old divisional commander, Joe Hooker. Joe Hooker, as I said, really loved the intelligence part. He was the one who supposedly said whoever saw a dead cavalryman, yet he wasn't negative about cavalry. He always thought it was used incorrectly. So he organizes the cavalry corps where all the horsemen in the Army of the Potomac are placed under one corps commander, under one leadership. And the third thing he did, he reorganized the provost marshal office, brought in Messina Patrick, a career officer, who immediately looked at the post office and said, we're getting a lot of packages with civilian clothes, and we're having a lot of desertion, and one of those 2 are connected. So he just took over the post office and stopped that. And Hooker created the Bureau of Military Information under Patrick's nominal command. The real commander was George Sharp, who was a colonel of the 120th New York. New York lawyer came in and organized that organization. So I'm sorry. So you're saying 63? What So
yeah, they're organized.
Yeah, all of this is happening in January and February. By the end of February, the Bureau of Military Information is already beginning to send scouts out, collecting information, what have you. And then, of course, you have Chancellorsville, and then we could talk about that too. But
is this bureau working in tandem with the Cavalry Corps? Is that what Hooker's mindset is? It's like they collect and gather, they bring that intel in, and then the cavalry can execute because they're fast moving, because they can, what's the thought there?
Again, I'm going to give both Hooker and Sharp real credit on this. That would have been easy to do. That would have been an improvement of what was happening. But they actually saw it as an all-information collection and analysis group. So that meant cavalry reports. That meant their own scout reports. That meant deserter interrogations. That meant contraband, slaves that escape interviews. That included the newspapers out of Richmond or every place else. That included reading the mail, then sealing it back up and taking it, getting it back so they wouldn't know. So it was a balloon ascent. Mm-hmm. So they were literally were creating an environment where all that information would come to one organization, and then on top they were to analyze it and present reports to the general, to Hooker.
Wow.
So that's a whole nother.
Yeah,
we could go do that some
that's
other
a whole
time.
nother episode.
I will say there were 18 enlisted men who started the Bureau, and then there were officers, obviously. 3 of the 18 were 3rd Indiana Cav.
Wow.
Because Hooker was familiar with their work from over in Eastern Maryland. So we talked about how depressed they were and how, the
kind of pays
morale
off.
and everything. They really were in training. They may have been the best, inadvertently best trained guys out there for this kind of work to join this organization.
Yeah, and I hate to, let's move backwards a little bit to 61 into 62 when they're there in Eastern Maryland. What training are they getting intelligence-wise? I know they're collecting it themselves, but are there other individuals or groups that are coming in to train them up a little bit or show them how intelligence gathering works?
They had exposure to so-called intelligence professionals. They had Pinkerton running around there. Pinkerton's, of course, was known as a railroad guy. McClellan had known him before the war because McClellan was a vice president of a railroad and had some problems with theft, so he hired Pinkerton to come in and help. So Pinkerton's agents are there, but they primarily tried, I think like 5 of his 28 agents actually tried to do some tactical kind of information gathering, what have you. He was really more about getting spies into Richmond and, kind of using his old intelligence process. The other guy that showed up was Lafayette Baker. Interesting character in history. Lafayette was what they call him. He was a vigilante in San Francisco to bring lawlessness under control. Came back when the war began. The Secretary of War heard of him, said, "Okay, you're hired." He didn't know much about him, so he would send them out to do the same work that Pinkerton did, except they reported not to the Army commander, but to the Secretary of War. So you had the third having to balance these two, and there's even instances where one agent would track the other agent and try and arrest each other because they didn't know who each other was. In the meantime, the third's in the middle of all this trying to deal with it. So training, I think Pinkerton probably offered a little bit in their dealings with him and his agents. They may have learned a little something. Some of it was just, let's go out and let's try this, We'll put some guys down at the bar and see if you can earn.
So no specific goal in mind, just kind of strike up a conversation, see where it goes.
Trying to find out
about what you can learn.
Yeah,
not a specific goal
stuff,
in mind.
Material. The main thing there is about material. Contraband
supplies
coming in
and
and
stuff
out.
like that.
Yep.
Okay. No. So not necessarily troop movements, because at that point in the war, the Confederates aren't that far into Maryland or anything like that.
Right.
Just supplies.
Yeah. At that time, it was almost totally supplied, and they were reasonably successful at that. But yes, there was, when we talk about espionage, it's really about ferreting out the traffic that was going on.
And there were places in Baltimore too, like obviously strongly Confederate sympathizing, that were supplying, whether it be coat buttons or ammunition. I don't know about ammunition, but more so uniforms and stuff like that. They were supporting the cause in some way or another.
Yeah, they actually caught a boat. That's how they became known as Horse Marines. Hooker called them his Horse Marines after a bunch of guys were out on scout and see a schooner that was having trouble, so they jump in a rowboat and row out. And the guys couldn't figure out the boat, so they dive in and swim away. So they captured the boat and didn't know what to do with it. They finally got to shore with some help of some U.S. Navy men. But they had like 87,000 percussion caps.
Wow.
All kinds of material that could be used.
Stuff intended for Richmond.
Absolutely.
Thousands of bullets. I mean, not bullets, buttons.
Buttons.
It was like 47 dozen buttons. Packs. It was.
And that's really... Won't tell you every item of the book, but the one thing that Chapman, because he was in an independent command with 3 of the companies, the only thing he ever asked to keep was an amputation set. He said, "We only have one, and we're probably going to need more."
Wasn't it the West Wing that had the one set?
No, he had one for the East Wing, but it was just one.
Yeah, and he's like,
it doesn't hurt to have another.
Yeah, he knew. I mean, he had some
and there's a neat story, as I was reading in your book, about 2 freshly dug graves that they were like, we should probably go check those out. They check them out. They find like 100 blankets.
And 2 dead Negroes.
Yeah.
To quote the statement. Yeah, it was in a cemetery.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. So
there was kind of weird things happening. I mean, and they were learning the tricks. And then, of course, as they got successful, then the agents around would go, okay, that didn't work. We got to try something different. Yeah. And then they'd have to respond to the change of tactics. So they were learning in not a formal way, but they were learning about espionage and how things can function during that time.
Yeah. Okay, so let's fast forward back to 1863. Let's just dive right into where the cavalry will get used the most at Brandy Station. What's happened in early June 1863 for the 3rd Indiana?
Well, the early June 63, Chapman's in command, and I wish I could give you the exact reason, but he's away. He's in D.C. No action was anticipated. He went up D.C. All the rest of the cavalry, however, were being ordered to gather around Beverly Ford because they were going to cross and see what they.
So they were in Buford's command?
At that time, they're in the 1st Division, 1st Brigade. So they got Buford as their commanding general. Their brigade commander was Gamble of the 8th New York. And they're ordered across midnight, or not midnight. They arrived at midnight and then had a camp with no food, no fires, quiet. Early morning, they cross towards Brandy Station. As they cross, of course, pickets fire, what have you. You have mad, crazy excitement in the Confederate camps because they had no idea this was coming. And frankly, the Federal didn't know they were there.
Yeah.
They thought they were 2 or 3 miles further south. So this was going to be a gathering point from the 3 divisions, and then they were going to go attack Stuart. Instead, they landed right on top of him.
So a surprise for both.
Surprise for both. But the initial surprise was definitely on the favor of the Union troops.
Sure.
They cross. William Gamble, their brigade commander, is kind of a hothead. He charges ahead. He's chasing. He's outdistanced his unit. The 3rd Indiana, I think, was 3rd in the column of the brigade. He gets caught by himself, and he's killed. So now you have a brigade without a leader. So they start sorting out who's the most senior officer. They sorted out that Major William McClure of the 3rd Indiana was the senior officer on the field.
Because Chapman's gone.
Yeah. So you've got McClure, who's command at best a couple companies in battle or even skirmish, what have you, now in command of three regiment in the biggest cavalry battle in the Western Hemisphere. So if you're familiar with Brandy Station, if you come across from the Beverly Ford, their fight usually, for the most part, spreads to your left, which is now the airfield.
Yeah.
So they're spending their time out on the landing
strips
and dodging all the lights and everything else. Obviously, that's been developed, but that's where they end up. Okay. So you have this guy who's been kind of the senior major in the regiment, so he kind of acted as the second in command, but had never really commanded in battle. And all of a sudden, he jumps from regimental command, which was already kind of a big deal. It was going to be his first time as regimental commander, to brigade command. So he fights and reasonably well. I think Buford, my opinion, looked at this and go, okay, I got Major McClure in command of the brigade there. I don't think I can expect a lot of him. He couldn't prove that, but he didn't want to test it. So that brigade is pretty static for the rest of the fighting before the retreat across.
Yeah, before they pull back that night.
Right.
Okay, so then does Chapman eventually return to the regiment?
Chapman does return. Of course, we go through June. You had not too long ago talking about Aldie and Middleburg and Upperville. They're fought there at a vicious little fight at Upperville where they get mauled a little bit, but they keep pushing. And, of course, they end up north of the Pennsylvania line, and the first patrol, the first scouting unit into Gettysburg is led by the 3rd Indiana.
Wow.
Where they are able to scoop up a few stragglers. I think there's a misconception that the Confederates had never been in Gettysburg until July 1, and that's not true. They marched through earlier, and in fact,
On to Harrisburg.
Buford missed them by just a few hours, but there, as always, were a few stragglers and were able to capture them. So June 30, they're camped out northwest of town on McPherson's Ridge.
July 1.
July 1.
Take me into the Battle of Gettysburg, Jim.
All right. Actually, their camp would have been a little bit behind McPherson's. McPherson's, I've always been correct. McPherson's Ridge would have been, if you've been there, you looked back, there's the railroad cut and all. There's a little bit of a low area back behind McPherson's Ridge. That's where the camp would have been. And early in the morning, Marcellus Jones, 8th Illinois, out on picket, is purported to have fired the first shot 2 or 3 miles outside of Gettysburg. So the cavalry were never expected to stand against infantry attack. That was just their weaponry wasn't designed for that. Their tactics weren't designed. But this is one case where they were expected to hold until the infantry showed. So for 4 hours, this thin line of cavalry, and I can't emphasize enough how thin it was, is holding off Heath's division. Early, the Confederate advance is coming slowly. They force them to go from column to line, which takes time, which was perfect. All they were trying to do is buy time. But they were also right behind the horse battery of the division. So a lot of the overfire hit the regiment. They had the highest number of casualties of Buford's division during the first day at Gettysburg.
Wow.
And we talked about there being 6 companies during the Battle of Gettysburg. Temporarily, 4 companies of the 12th Illinois were attached to them. So Chapman had command of 10 companies for maybe the first and only time in the war where they actually could fight as a full regiment. So Iron Brigade, Wadsworth Division, they all come running up. They release them. They retreat back into town. They're moved down to the south, down where Devil's Den is, basically. They're sent there to keep watch to see if there's anything else coming down the Chambersburg Pike there. As the Confederate attack develops, there is indeed troops coming, and it's extending further and further south and overlapping the Union line. At that time, I think Doubleday was still in command. I don't know if Scott or Hancock had arrived yet or not, but they said we've got to buy time. These guys are out at the seminary. They're out north of town. They're beginning to get overpowered. We got to buy time, get them through town, or we're going to lose half the army. So they are sent along a stone wall just south of the seminary. If you go to the seminary and go look about 200-300 yards south of the seminary, there's still a stone wall there. And they are placed there, and they are able to hold the attack for about a half an hour to allow the retreat to continue. So at that point, they're moved to the Peach Orchard. Well, actually, there's one other action later in the afternoon, but later they're placed basically at the Peach Orchard, Plum Run area. And the next morning, Buford asked permission, can I move my troops back for refit and what have you, and he was given permission. A lot of people blame him for that. I think Meade was a guy that maybe should take that command because all he had to do is say, no, I need you here and you're not going anywhere. But he said, yeah, nothing much happened. Go ahead. So they ride out of Gettysburg.
Is that it?
That's it
Okay.
for the 3rd.
So that's it for the 3rd. And then going on through the remainder of the summer into fall of 1863, are they in pursuit of Lee's army? Where are they going? Okay.
Yeah, they're in pursuit. When you leave Gettysburg, of course, the next action is down around the crossings at the Potomac, Falling River and Falling Water, excuse me. Once Lee gets across, he's bought some time. Of course, as we know here in Winchester, a lot of the wounded from Gettysburg ended up here. Would have had to cross at Falling Waters to get here. It would have been a harrowing trip. I can't imagine what that would have been like. For the cavalry, there's no rest. They want to keep pressuring. By that time, Lee has retreated south across the Rappahannock. So they're keeping pressing, trying to, and then we get a little bit of what most people call kind of a static war, because now there's not big army movements going on, but a lot of activity by the cavalry. They're busy throughout 63.
Especially when there's rivers dividing or creeks dividing armies. It's the cavalry that'll be the most active at that time, I think.
Right. A very little known battle that is not well known is Riddle's Shop, which the name escapes me now. Its current name, it's changed name, but Jack's Shop, excuse me, Jack's Shop. Yes, Jack.
Not my shop.
Where Buford and Kilpatrick's divisions nearly catch Stuart in a vice. He gets out by the skin of his teeth. But that was just part of this. That was part of a reconnaissance because Meade was getting ready to try to move south. And the next day, we hear about Chattanooga, or Chickamauga, we hear about Chattanooga, and they go, okay, we got to send troops from the east to the west. And Meade had to go on the defensive. He didn't have enough troops to go on the offensive. So that battle was needless because, as it turned out, the intelligence they gathered couldn't be used.
Okay, so we get into fall and now the winter. It's a new year now, let's say 1864. Where's the 3rd Indiana going to be attached to? Who's their leader? Not the regiment's leader, but who are they under the command of?
By this point, you're getting close, not quite, but you're getting close to having Grant join. They're with the Army of the Potomac. They did picket all through the winter on the Rappahannock. And then you get to really Grant come. There's not a lot of activity until Grant arrives. There's one change. Meade liked intelligence, didn't want anybody to tell him about it. So those spies and agents of the Bureau of Military Intelligence would gather the information, but all they would do is hand him the raw information. There was no analysis. So where that would have been probably critical was when they went, when Chattanooga fell, Sharp knew that. That word got to him before it went through the telegraph to Washington down, and he passed that to Meade, but he didn't think, I better do something fast to take the pressure out, So again, there was no analysis. But Grant liked intelligence, and he liked to use his cavalry a lot. I would argue Grant overuses cavalry. There are 3 raids from Richmond down, by that time we're at Petersburg. There are 3 raids involved around Petersburg, and the 3rd Division was the only division that partook of all 3. The other 2 were out at Trevilian Station and doing the other 2 around. So this was a burner of bodies, horses, energy. It was the most arduous service that the unit had seen throughout the war.
Are these 3 raids?
Yes.
During these raids, what are the 3 off the top of your head?
Well, the first one was Kilpatrick had this wild, harebrained idea that he could go down at that time to Richmond and release all the prisoners of Belle Isle. And Lincoln, he talked to the Corps commander, and no, I don't think so. But Kilpatrick wasn't satisfied that. He went to Washington, talked to Lincoln, and Lincoln said, well, let's try it. So he went over Meade's, everybody's had to go to the presidents. That didn't make him very popular. Secondly, Kilpatrick, I don't think was a very good tactician. they created this strike force, for lack of a better term, about 5,000 cavalry, but they were only drawn from all the regiments and then regrouping them into different units. So the men and officers didn't really know each other. It was a real mess. So that was one. The second one would have been Sheridan's raid, which ended up at Yellow Tavern, the death of Jeb Stuart. That one actually went pretty well. The men were amazed that they were allowed to rest their horses on that raid compared to Kilpatrick, who was known as Kill Cavalry. Mm-hmm. Not because a lot of government got killed. He killed the horses. He ran them everywhere. And then the third one was Wilson Count's raid, which is lesser known, but I think fascinating because 1st and 2nd Division are out Trevilian Station. Sheridan's out there fighting Hampton. And Grant says, I need to know more about it, and I'll take a diversion way to hold cavalry, the Confederate cavalry, by another raid. So he sends them against the South Side Railroad.
So that's what that raid is.
And unfortunately, it didn't end well for a lot of people.
Wow. I'm going on a tour at the end of October to the Appomattox.
I've seen
Petersburg
that.
Preservation Society is hosting a tour.
Yeah.
If you want to go, I'm driving down. So
all right.
go. Yeah.
We'll talk later.
Okay. Yeah. But
because I've not actually been on that area. I've read a lot about it and written about it, but not
that's like
to say this.
Stanton River Bridge. And,
yes, all of that.
So this is where in you said that is it 3rd Brigade or 3rd?
At that point, they've been switched from the 1st Division to the 3rd because some young upstart was made general and they had a problem, and so they just switched people around.
But the 3rd Indiana is in all of those raids.
Yes.
Wow. So
they're nearly burned out. I mean,
and this is just the beginning, kind of 64 for them, right?
Yeah, well, this would have gotten us to July 64.
Okay. So
the original enlistees, their time is up in August 22nd, 64.
So they're counting down the days.
They thought they had been given the chance to veteranize, which would have given them furloughs and everything else. Somehow that vote was not accepted and they had to revote again. And the guys were going, wait a minute. We were going to go home.
Yeah.
What? So they did not.
So this is July. What's happening? So into August, you said this is almost up now.
Yep. No, they're literally pulled off the line, sent to Washington. 57 men did veteranize, re-enlist. And you had 130 men who were enlistees after that point. There were recruits that came in 62, 63, whatever. So they reorganized them into 2 companies, A and B. And all of this is happening about the time that Early's running up and down the valley, scaring the bejeebers out of Washington and what have you.
Yeah.
So that's when Phil Sheridan is sent to the valley. He takes 2 divisions of cavalry with him. The 3rd Indiana then goes to the valley in July of 64, September 64, and join. Now, they're 2 companies. They're not really a viable military, so they're assigned to the 3rd Division as an escort.
So by this point, there's only 2 companies of the 3rd left.
Right.
The rest, you said?
Chapman's been promoted to a general.
Wow.
He's in brigade command.
Where?
In the 3rd Division.
Okay.
So they, one unit, one company assigned to his command, the other was division command. They eventually consolidate them as men left. As their times, if you joined in October of 61, well, in October of 64, you left. So the numbers kept dwindling down.
And this is, at least in our eyes now, this is when it's getting serious for the Valley.
Yeah.
And where cavalry is going to,
exactly
make its name, at least in the Valley, too. So 2 companies of the 3rd Indiana are left by September. Right. And they arrive in September, like you said. So, and this is just in time for the 3rd Battle of Winchester.
Cedar Creek.
Yeah. So the
Tomsbrook.
Everything, really.
So what's their involvement briefly in the Sheridan's Valley campaign?
Well, by that point, they are, as I say, escort for the 3rd Division, who at that time was James Wilson, was the commander general in command of the 3rd Division. So they're part of Wilson's command that crosses the river in the morning of September 19. They're actually the lead. They're going to cross the river to kick off 3rd Winchester. Then Wilson's division was to move south and hook around to the Valley Pike.
Oh, you mean, Opequon Creek, right?
Opequon Creek.
So they're crossing on the Berryville Pike.
Yes.
Not where Averill and them are crossing north on the Opequon at Brucetown and other places.
1st Division was the beachhead. They were to open the door.
Shock troops.
Route 7.
Yeah,
today,
Berryville
right?
Canyon. Yep.
Route 7, okay.
And then there we're to swing around, like I say, to the south and cut off the pike because, Sheridan's really thought, we're going to knock them here and push them back. I'm going to put a cork in the bottle. They got down to Millwood, Abrams Creek, somewhere around the mall, if you're familiar with Winchester or Shenandoah Universities, and that's about as far as they got. 3rd Division was their smallest division. It was an inadequate force to do what they were meant to do.
So that's where they were during 3rd Winchester.
Right.
Okay, so...
But not Fisher's Hill, because by that point, Sheridan says, let's try again.
Couple days after 3rd Winchester,
Couple days after. He sends all the cavalry down the Page Valley to go around to Luray across to Newmarket. He wants to put the cork in the bottle again. This time, the cavalry was not up to, if you go down the Page Valley to Overall, was known as Milford at that time, there was a small Confederate cavalry unit blocking them.
Unit or like brigade or regiment?
Yeah, a couple. Yeah, let's call it a brigade.
Okay.
I'm not sure. It was not very big.
Okay.
The Union troops were not very aggressive.
This is the entire Union cavalry force.
Yes. By this point, there's at least 2 divisions, if not 3 divisions, stacked up, waiting to get through. Can't get through.
Thousands of cavalrymen.
Thousands of cavalry. They turn around, Torbert, who was the cavalry commander, can't do it. Started back, got to about Goonie Creek, and message came back and from Sheridan said, what do you mean you can't do that? I'll find somebody who can. Oh, let us try one more time. So they turned around. They went back to Milford. They had since moved because the fight at Fisher's Creek, they were going to be left completely isolated and retreat. So they retreat. They get down to 3rd Division, or the cavalry get down to Luray, not able to catch up to them. They get through, go down past Harrisonburg and beyond. After that, October 1, there is a change involving another young upstart Union general.
Have we heard of him before?
I think you may have heard of him. He was a brigade commander that had been moved to division command. His name was George Armstrong Custer. So George Armstrong becomes their new division commander. They knew George. The 3rd had known George off and on for a number of contacts throughout 63 and 64. So it was like, oh, hey, George. George being like 25 at the time. He's similar in age to a lot of the troopers. But during the burning, they're actually that's where they began as his escort and escorted him then through the rest of the war.
Wow. So what's their participation in the burning?
The burning would have been more message running and what have you. It was just 2 companies, and by that time there may be 150 men.
Wow, so just
they
small.
would have been more, Now they did have action at Tom's Brook, the infamous the bow before the battle.
Yeah.
And then there are excerpts where they talk about Custer and his escort leading the charge across the creek that precipitated Rosser's retreat there at Tom's Brook.
But other than that,
not really a lot of combat. Again, the scouts are out and about. When we get to 64, they hang out here in Winchester through the winter. And then in spring, in late February, they head up the valley once again. And Waynesboro occurs in March of 65, early March.
And they're there.
Custer was the attacker, and essentially he was ordered not to bring on any action. And he said, I got enough men. I'll just...
Wasn't much of an action.
Wasn't much of an action. So, yes, they were there, and then they rode with Sheridan all the way around to Petersburg. And then, of course, with Custer, and I think it's well known, Custer was one of the officers that received the flag of truce at Appomattox, and, of course, his escort would have been there.
So at Tom's Brook, being Custer's escort, were they part of that chase of Rosser's cavalry, just as a kind of a
races,
of a gotcha kind of? Because I've read on that brotherly love between Rosser and and Custer, was that more of like were they a part of that?
Let's start with brotherly love. They were classmates.
If you call it that.
They were classmates at West Point. I don't think they were enemies, but I think a lot of people make it out like, oh, they were best buds. They were classmates. So they knew each other, probably friendly, but I don't know if they were best buds. Tom's Brook actually has two separate fields of action.
Back Road, Valley Pike.
The Back Road and the Valley Pike. And they're back on the Back Road. Mm-hmm. So the Woodstock races technically would have been the part on the Valley Road.
Lomax's guys.
Lomax gets down to Woodstock, tries to stop, doesn't work, and then the race goes. They run 20 miles south. Rosser only ran about 12 miles, to be fair. He didn't go about to Columbia Furnace. But yes, they were part of that, and they talk about how gleeful they are around the fire that night. You know, of course, they've won. They've captured artillery back that they had lost on the Kautz-Wilson raid. They could identify the weapons as, yep, these were our horse artillery. We had to leave. They recaptured it. That's a point of honor. They're pretty excited about that. Of course, they captured everything, including Ross's dress uniform. And there's a great story they tell about 5'0", Custer was maybe 5'6", 5'7". Rosser was about 6'4". And Custer was walking around the campfire with the oversized coat. And everybody's hooting and hollering. And he later gives that coat to West Point.
Wow.
Where I think it still resides today.
That's cool. Wow. So I guess after the war, come April of 65 into May and June, they're just fully disbanded.
Yeah, I think like a lot of veterans, once the war ended, they're ready to go home. I mean, April 10th, they expected to be on the road to Indiana. I mean, right after the surrender. Now, obviously, demobilization, whatever, it takes a lot more time. Actually, the only thing they were really worried about at that time, other than going home, was Sherman's army was coming. They're in North Carolina and coming around. The western wing of the 3rd Indiana had been consolidated with the 8th Indiana Cavalry, and they were heading north. And there were actually orders that these men in the eastern ring were to report to Sherman and be integrated into the 8th Indiana, and they wanted nothing to do with it.
Obviously, yeah.
They were 3rd Indiana, and they would die.
They were at the surrender. It's like
they were at surrender at Appomattox. The interesting thing is you have 3rd Indiana at Appomattox, but you also have 3rd Indiana at Bentonville.
Wow.
So they were the units were represented both places. So Custer, I think, actually finagled it to get his division ordered to Washington so he could take him away. That's not the only reason, but I think that was a byproduct. And I think he kind of recognized, again, he knew some of these men for 2 or 3 years. Yeah. And so they go back, they do the grand march through Washington, the parades and everything. They're carrying all the battle flags that what Custer captured as part of his escort, and then they head home.
Wow. So, well, that's such a, it's.
And our horses are tired and we must rest.
There you go. There you go. I wouldn't be doing the podcast credit if I didn't ask a little bit about some battlefield stuff with the 3rd Indiana. Sure. What battlefields can folks visit today where 3rd Indiana was present, fought, engaged? How many battlefields have monuments to them? Is it just Gettysburg?
You've got 2.
Okay.
They were at Antietam. The cavalry was not very active in Antietam. They had basically a support of artillery. So there's a little 18 by 24 plaque along the road there. If you know where to look, you might see it. Gettysburg obviously is there. 3rd Winchester, of course. Tom's Brook. I'm trying to think.
The raids.
Raids, they're all there, and certainly part of that is preserved that you could go visit. Middletown, Maryland, was a very vicious cavalry battle of about 15 minutes that they probably sustained as many or more casualties there than they did at Gettysburg. But not as much left. I mean, it's rural if you knew what you're looking, but again, it's not preserved.
And have you been out, when you were writing those first couple chapters of the book, did you ever, or have you visited since that area of Eastern Maryland where they spent those long months?
It's been a long time. I need to go back because I think it's. I talked to someone not too long ago who lived there a while, and they said, "Oh yeah, it's changed a lot." So I almost don't want to.
But just I think it's interesting as you read and try to imagine what 1861, 1862 would have looked like. Along the rivers and the coves of the Potomac, and just what their lives must have been like for those months and months, just waiting and watching. And
I think there's certainly, particularly from the river view, you could go down the Potomac and you look at the shoreline. I bet there are large chunks of it that look virtually identical to what it looked like 160 years ago.
Yeah,
because it's not developed and what have you. So, yes, I think there's potential to do that and see that. They are actually at Point Lookout before it became Point Lookout, which was the exchange point for prisoners and what have you, and they were actually stationed out there in that winter.
Wow.
And that's now a state park, so you can visit that.
Well, Jim, Hoosiers, Spies, and Horse Marines, A History of the 3rd Indiana Cavalry, East Wing. Your new book. Where can people buy it? McFarland Publishing, Amazon, anywhere else?
All those, any online, I think, can be purchased. I've got a few signings if anybody's interested. Back in Indiana, shout out to my Indiana friends.
When will you be and where will you be in
Okay, Monday the 9th
of October 2023.
I will be in Vevey, Switzerland County, at the American Legion.
There you go.
At 7 o'clock, be doing a presentation and signing. Have a private thing on Tuesday. Had to be a member, so I can't really advertise that.
Okay.
Thursday, the 12th, I'll be in Madison, Indiana, at the Jefferson County Museum, and that's at 6 o'clock. And then Friday, the 13th, I'll be in Lawrenceburg, Indiana.
Okay.
Not at the distillery, but I'll be at the Dearborn County Historical Society for a signing from 1 to 4.
Well, exciting stuff. And the couple years I've known you, I know you've been wanting to get this out and done, and it's so cool to kind of come full circle with it. So thank you so much for coming on. I know we're going to have you on in future episodes to talk about different topics, more the investigation side of things, the intelligence side of things.
Which I think is fascinating, and I'd
it does not get covered as much.
No, not at all.
Love to cover that, and maybe the Tom's Brook episode, because you're my Tom's Brook guy when it comes to stuff like that. So thank you so much for coming on. This bourbon, I think, was really great. Like you said, for a high rye, really sweet. I don't know if you guys have been sipping on it the whole episode, so if there's anything else you want to add about this Remus.
I've noticed the more I get throughout the episode, there's like a little bit of a minty kind of, almost like a spearmint note in there. And I would assume that's from the rye, because I've heard other folks say that rye whiskeys will sometimes give you a minty kind of flavor in there. And I've been getting that as I sip on it, which is really interesting. But I think that's part of that uniqueness that I was getting at the beginning of the episode.
Yeah. I think it was an nice one to sip on.
Yeah. It's one of those that I'm going to have to buy it.
Yeah.
There you go. Easy to get, too. That's
easy
the cool
to get
thing
here
about
in
this.
Virginia. Yeah, that's always great, too.
And I'm sure for Indiana folks, this is like, on your doorstep every day, maybe. Hopefully,
Bread and
it should
butter,
be.
for
So.
I don't know if they do home delivery yet, but we'll work with it.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. I encourage everyone to go
Thank
out
you.
and get that
Yeah.
book. If you're in Indiana or close by, go to his tour coming up here in October. And if you have any questions, hit us in the direct messages, the private messages, and we can send them to Jim so he can get some answers for you. But thank you so much for listening. And Elijah.
Until
Thanks,
next
guys.
time.
Appreciate it.
Yep.